As an introduction to our 3 days together here at Heidelberg's International Academic Forum, I see it my task to outline the important, essential questions that guide the work of the Critical Film and Image Hub at the Research Center on Antigypsyism and the conception of our first, excitingly international conference called Visibilities of Memory, the representation of Sinti and Roma in Holocaust film. I have only a few precious minutes, so I will get right to the heart of the matter. If we have to give an impactful, people-oriented, one-word definition of the transcultural phenomenon of anti-Gypsyism, that would be Empathieverbot. German language is so helpful with one-word definitions. In English, anti-Gypsyism can thus be translated as a cultural ban, a prohibition on empathy. Not only during the period between 1933 and 1945, when Roma in most European countries were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis and their allies, but also before and after the genocide. We all gathered here, I'm sure, can report of recent pogroms or of state-orchestrated home demolitions, which left the general public indifferent. Too often, we have witnessed Roma individuals who somehow feel forced to pledge their humanity. What a culturally instilled form of humiliation, wouldn't you say, 80 years after the Holocaust? This Empathieverbot, this collectively instilled numbness towards Roma, is part and parcel of Europe's cultural DNA. It is ingrained in the literary and artistic canon of all national cultures. If you leaf through the groundbreaking works of Klaus Michael Bogdel and Hans Richard Brittnacher, two of our special guests here, you will spot the names of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Hans Jakob Grimmelshausen in German literature, Miguel de Cervantes y Garcia Lorca in Spanish literature, Proper Mérimée and Victor Hugo in French literature, Ernest Hemingway and Stephen King in American literature, William Wordsworth, Charlotte Bronte and D.H. Lawrence in British literature, Maxim Gorky, Alexander Pushkin and Fyodor Dostoevsky in Russian literature, Ivo Andrić and Ivan Vazov in Eastern European literature, I'm sorry to give it so abbreviated, and so on. Quite similar is the situation in the fine arts. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, Jan Levens, or William Turner. In music, in opera, in theater, in photography, and film. Think of D.W. Griffith, Joseph Losey, or Emil Kusturica. No other minority, I dare say, has been so consistently and blindly, not to say brutally, instrumentalized for the construction of the self-congratulatory national images across the self-proclaimed old continent. Let us expand our attempt at definition by foregrounding social imaginaries, which will help us understand the role of literary imagination in collective identities. The image of an exuberantly colorful underworld, marked by poverty, crime, and magic, understood as the social and moral bottom that is incompatible with the national idea, has been vividly present in European national literatures and arts since 1613, when Cervantes published his exemplary novella La Gitanilla. In celebrated literary works, in theatrical, opera, and musical pieces, in paintings, drawings, and children's books illustrations, even in nursery rhymes, in comics, manga, and video games, this image has been projected onto various social groups and minorities known nowadays under the umbrella term Roma, or Sinti and Roma in Germany, but also onto Yenish people, on migrants and social misfits, on Europe's southern people, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, renewed on Europe's east, especially the Balkans. Film, the most accessible and understandable medium in the modern world, has turned this image into global common knowledge. In fact, Hollywood's history begins with the central anti-Gypsyist motive, the highly lucrative story of child kidnapping. The Adventures of Dolly, a film from 1908, directed by D.W. Griffith, which directly echoes Cervantes' novella some 300 years later. I see film not as one of the many art forms, but as their pinnacle in a way, the towering height of artistic achievement of literature, music, visual and performance arts, photography, and modern science in Europe, all brought in one. Film recycles, condenses, intensifies, preferably stories promising a box office hit. Thus, the well-executed, often craze-inducing feature films offer the concentrated form of anti-Gypsyism, a soft, routine propaganda of a kind. And there are hundreds of such feature films, so I will dare say that in our modern world it is film that should be held responsible for being the main and most impactful purveyor of anti-Gypsyism. Seeing is believing, as they say. In other words, since the dawn of cinema, the immersive and persuasive power of film has been hijacked to produce collective indifference towards Roma. The result is there today, just as it was in the darkest moment of Europe's history. We cannot explain the augur of the Holocaust with the workings of film, but we can explain, I believe, the prevailing apathy towards the Roma genocide, why it was and remained unseen, unheard, disregarded for so long. My extensive film corpus suggests that the Nazis did not see it necessary to produce propaganda feature films such as Jutsus. The image of the criminal underworld was already planted in the collective imagination. Whereas in the past 80 years, only a handful of good feature films, not more than 10, have been produced to give credence to the Roma genocide. I see all these as symptoms of the cultural ban on empathy, Holocaust being its most radical form. So we, the Critical Film and Image Hub, have set ourselves the task to question the normalcy and the ubiquity of this stigmatizing imaginary through interdisciplinary research, educational outreach, and dialogue with filmmakers. We are an international and interdisciplinary team of researchers and educators, and we aim to bring a turn in film studies, in filmmaking, and in critical film literacy. Breaking the film of anti-Gypsyism is our watchword. What sets us apart, our Alleinstellungsmerkmal, to pay another homage to German, is the understanding that we cannot stay in the ivory tower of the academia, but need to make the next vital step and explore ways of connecting research findings to creative work, translating scientific knowledge into artistic praxis. We want to amplify the fruits of our scientific endeavor by channeling the imaginative power of film in the opposite direction, emboldening counter-narratives that foster empathy for all those who have been chronically excluded from the solidarity of the nation's we. Placing a focus on the subgenre of Holocaust film, we will explore together during the conference the multifaceted potential of film. Film as an empathy machine, film as an imaginarium of socially just ideas, as a historical document, as a prosthetic memory, as a space for dialogue between generations, film as a tool for social change and activism, for cultural research, for education, in film and critical media literacy. So, what are the challenges that we, as scholars, educators, democrats, and human beings are facing nowadays? One huge challenge is transforming democracy into a collective mental disposition, into a mentality that shapes individual and group behavior. This is the vision encapsulated in the title of the federal program of the German Ministry for Education and Family Affairs that funds the Critical Film and Image Hub. The program is called Live Democracy, Demokratie leben. But how? This has become the urgent question today. What potential does film have in this respect? How to open up cinema audiences and make them willing to engage with the extremely traumatic history of Shoah and the Roma genocide? How to shape this inner attitude, this cognitive and emotional receptivity? How can we reach young people who barely know what Auschwitz means? And what to do at a time when most eyewitnesses have passed away, while digital technologies are ever more rapidly increasing the distance to the darkest chapter of Europe's history. There are some recent developments that offer innovative digital solutions, but not without controversy. At this year's Cannes Film Festival, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation and the Auschwitz Museum presented their project called Picture from Auschwitz, which involves a digital scan of the concentration camp. Created using 3D technology, it will allow filmmakers to use Auschwitz as a film set in the future. The digitalization project enables the production of low-cost films that can reach a wider audience. And another technology-driven project, the USC Shoah Foundation, founded by Steven Spielberg, is currently using the latest film and programming technology to train its algorithms, the aim being to develop a digital avatar of the 91-year-old Holocaust survivor Pinchas Gata. This virtual version of Pinchas will be able to automatically answer questions from future generations and, as a three-dimensional hologram, fill the physical void left by the eyewitnesses of the Holocaust. One might immediately raise the question, must eyewitnesses continue to educate others beyond their deaths, or should they simply be allowed to rest in peace? Does this also mean that we are simply transferring the inability to take responsibility for our actions to digital technologies? However, I would like to raise the bar and tie all these projects and questions to a phenomenon of a new unprecedented magnitude. I was moved by a recent essay called Will the Humanities Survive Artificial Intelligence? By D. Graham Burnett, a professor of the history of science at Princeton University. Burnett speaks of staggering transformations in full swing that urgently require a response from the humanities. In his words, AI tools herald the end of the humanities, at least the way we know them. Software engineers have a reason to feel like minor deities, minor gods. They have captured mathematically the human being as he or she appears on a screen, which is how we reach out to each other these days. So if we think of Pinchas Gata, the Holocaust survivor, it means that after a certain period of training, his life story and moves will be seized by this astonishingly successful application of probabilistic prediction and thus rendered as a mathematical pattern. To me, this is dehumanization at its pinnacle and a development we cannot evade, but I think it's a topic for another conference. Burnett laments that over the past more than 70 years, the humanities have largely lost sight of their true purpose. That is the fundamental question of being. Seduced by the rising prestige of the sciences, scholars have reshaped their work to mimic scientific inquiry. Burnett predicts that, quote, within 5 years it will make little sense for scholars of history to keep producing monographs in the traditional mold. Nobody will read them, and large language models will be able to generate them endlessly at the push of a button. End of quote. Nevertheless, he envisions one optimistic scenario in which the humanities return to their project, their real project, the work of understanding, the deeper questions of human existence, and not factory-style accumulation of facts. So while reflecting on Burnett's essay, I happened to read Anton Chekhov's novella, A Dreary Story, which was published on this day, 12th of November in 1889. I bring it here to vouch for the enduring value of quality literature. Chekhov's story is about an eminent professor of medical science who boasts the most prestigious international awards, the equivalent of a Nobel Prize today. The reader is made privy to his inner monologue and thus to the inner world of a scientist, the most authoritative figure of the 19th century, the leading light in society at the time. The professor has a close bond with only one person, his sweet foster daughter Katya. Yet when Katya, who has suffered heavy blows in life, losing her newborn child and her self-belief, turns to him and again with the questions, what to do, how to live, pleading for a word of advice, the luminary is unable to help her. Nikolai Stepanovich cannot offer her moral support, or even embrace the young woman. To put it in a nutshell, Chekhov's novella puts on record the unacknowledged indifference of the natural sciences to the human spirit and the urgent questions of being that it faces. As scholars of the humanities, it is our duty to deepen the knowledge of the past, particularly about the whys and hows of the disregarded genocide against the Roma. However, as Chekhov warns us from the heyday of professionalized science, knowledge production will be of little help unless we find ways to make it relevant to self-knowledge, us being the custodians of historical consciousness and the achievements of the human spirit. Self-knowledge is central to decision-making and action. In other words, to finding concrete answers to the pressing challenges of being. As Burnett asserts in his essay, no amount of peer-reviewed scholarship, no data set can resolve the central questions that confront every human being. How to live, what to do, how to face death.